Los Angeles, early 1964. Inside the studio, the silence is heavier than any argument. You can hear it between breaths. The producer checks his watch, voice flat, almost bored. Dean, you've got 60 seconds. Bring something new, or this record is dead. It isn't a threat. It's procedure. Radio has stopped trusting ballads. The audience is younger. The charts move faster. The label doesn't wait anymore. Dean Martin doesn't smile, doesn't stall, doesn't ask for another meeting. He picks up a pencil, not to chase a rhyme, not to sound current, but to write down what he's been carrying quietly for years. The clock ticks. No melody, no guitar, just words that were never meant for a deadline. When the minute is over, no one in the room laughs. No one speaks. Because what he put on that paper doesn't sound like a comeback. It sounds like something the industry wasn't supposed to hear, and something a man like Dean Martin was never supposed to admit out loud. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Los Angeles, mid-1960s. The building looked the same as it always had. Stucco walls, a brass plaque by the door, windows that never opened, but inside, something had shifted. Dean Martin felt it the moment he stepped into the corridor. Not hostility. Worse, familiarity turning into indifference. The studio office was too bright. Fluorescent light flattened faces, drained warmth from the room. Papers were stacked with care, contracts aligned, coffee untouched. Everything suggested order, control, no urgency. The producer didn't stand up when Dean entered. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile meant to keep things calm, not warm. "Dean," he said, "sit." Dean did. He placed his hat beside him, slow, deliberate. His posture was relaxed, almost lazy, but his eyes were alert. He had learned long ago that stillness unsettled people more than anger. They spoke about numbers first, not sales, trends. The word hovered in the air like a warning sign. "Radio's changing," the producer said, tapping a folder without opening it. "Shorter attention spans, simpler lyrics. Kids want something they can hum without thinking." Dean nodded once. He didn't interrupt. "You've always been steady," the man continued, choosing the word carefully. "Reliable. But the market's moving fast now." There it was, not obsolete, not finished, just no longer necessary. Dean leaned back slightly. "You're saying I'm not a problem," he said calmly. "I'm just not urgent." The producer hesitated. That was answer enough. He went on, softer now. "The label doesn't want to wait. They're nervous about anything that feels reflective, too grown, too quiet." Dean glanced at the papers on the desk. None of them had his handwriting. None had his voice. He realized, with a flicker of something cold behind his ribs, that decisions had already been discussed before he'd been invited into the room. "There was talk last spring," the producer added, almost as an aside, "about pulling one of your singles from daytime rotation." Dean looked up. "Which one?" A pause, just long enough to matter. "It didn't happen," the producer said quickly. "Someone argued for you." Dean absorbed that in silence. A song nearly erased without him ever knowing. A hit surviving by a margin he'd never been allowed to see. "And," the producer continued, clearing his throat, "we're testing a few new voices. Nothing official. Just options." Options. A replacement that hadn't yet earned the right to be called one. Dean felt no urge to argue, no spike of panic. What settled over him instead was something heavier. Clarity. For years, his name had carried weight. Tonight, it was being measured against a clock. "So," the producer said, finally opening the folder. Inside were blank pages. "If there's something new, something undeniable. We listen. One song could still tip the scale. Dean studied the empty paper. He understood the terms. Not loyalty, not legacy. One chance, stripped of sentiment. He stood, picked up his hat. "I'll bring you something," he said. No promise, no flourish. As he walked back down the corridor, the studio felt colder than before. Not because he was angry, but because he wasn't. Calm had replaced comfort. And that was dangerous. For the first time in years, Dean Martin understood that his career wasn't slipping loudly. It was going quiet. The producer didn't dramatize it. That was the unsettling part. He set the small kitchen timer on the desk between them, turned the dial once, and the quiet click sounded louder than it should have. 60 seconds. Not a challenge. Not a stunt. Just a way to end the conversation without pretending there was more time than there was. "This isn't a test," the producer said. "It's a courtesy." Dean stood by the window, jacket still on, not looking at the timer. Outside, Los Angeles moved on as usual. Cars sliding through intersections, palm leaves barely reacting to the wind. The world had never waited for songs. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen. No notebook. No guitar. That alone would have confused most people in the room, if there had been more people. The ticking began. Dean didn't rush it. He leaned against the desk, stared at a blank sheet of paper, and let the noise pass through him. Years earlier, he might have tried to outsmart the moment, find a phrase that sounded young, wrap honesty in polish. Not now. He wasn't trying to write a hit. He was tired of pretending he knew what one sounded like. What came first wasn't melody, but an image, the empty hallway behind a stage, applause fading like a door closing. He wrote a single line about that, then crossed it out. Too neat? Too rehearsed? The pen moved again, slower. He wrote about the silence after laughter, about hotel rooms that all smelled the same, about conversations that ended the moment the lights went off. Nothing clever, nothing rhythmic, just facts he'd learned by standing still long enough to notice them. The timer kept ticking. He didn't think about radio. He didn't think about charts. He didn't think about anyone listening. That was the point. For once, there was no one to impress. Halfway through, he stopped and reread what he had. Then, without hesitation, he drew a line through nearly half the page. Not out of doubt, out of respect. Too many words hid the truth instead of carrying it. The producer watched, but didn't interrupt. He had expected panic, maybe irritation. Instead, he saw something closer to restraint. Like a man choosing not to speak until the right sentence arrived. With 10 seconds left, Dean added one final line at the bottom. It didn't rhyme. It didn't resolve anything. It simply admitted something he'd never said aloud, that the noise of the business had taught him how to perform, but not how to be alone. The timer rang. Dean didn't look up. He placed the pen down gently, as if sound itself mattered now. "I didn't write music," he said quietly, pushing the page across the desk. "Just words." The producer picked it up, surprised. This wasn't how it was done. Lyrics came after melodies, not before. Structure mattered. Formula mattered. Dean finally met his eyes. There was no apology there, no defiance either. "I've been quiet a long time," he said. "This just caught up." For a moment, the ticking echo still seemed to hang in the room, even though the timer had stopped. What lay on the paper wasn't a miracle. It was the residue of years spent holding things back. And both men understood, without saying it, that whatever this was, it hadn't come from 60 seconds. It had come from everything before them. Dean didn't clear his throat before reading. He didn't preface the page with context or humor. He simply held the paper at chest level and began, his voice lower than it ever was on stage, stripped of cadence. There was no melody to lean on, no timing to hide behind. The room adjusted around that voice, not dramatically, not all at once, but shoulders shifted. A pen stopped tapping. The hum of the fluorescent light suddenly felt intrusive, like something that didn't belong in the middle of a confession. Dean read slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because he allowed space between them. He let the lines land where they landed, a sentence about applause fading into hallways, another about conversations that only existed under spotlights, a simple statement about smiling because it was easier than explaining what came after. No one interrupted. The producer had expected a reaction in himself, a mental checklist, notes forming automatically. Instead, he found his attention narrowing. This wasn't something to evaluate. It was something to endure. Halfway through, he recognized a line that didn't sound written. It sounded remembered, not shaped for effect, not engineered. Something too specific to belong to anyone else. When Dean reached the final line, his voice didn't drop. It didn't swell either. He read it the same way he had read the rest, as if refusing to protect it. Then he stopped. No one spoke. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was occupied. Like the room was busy processing something it hadn't planned for. The producer finally looked up from the page. "Is that?" He hesitated, then tried again. "Is any of this autobiographical?" Dean folded the paper once, carefully. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The lack of denial said more than any explanation could have. Near the wall, the assistant had turned away slightly, pretending to organize files that didn't need organizing. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't wipe them right away. She waited, as if movement might break something fragile. The producer leaned back in his chair. He wasn't thinking about radio anymore, or audiences, or demographics. What sat heavy in his chest was something far less professional. "This isn't a hit," he said slowly. Dean didn't react. "It's exposed," the producer continued. "That's the problem. Or the opportunity." He didn't say that part out loud. He looked again at the page. No chorus to soften the blow. No clever turn to make it palatable. Just a straight line from silence to truth, without detours. "If this goes out," he added, "some people won't like it. They'll feel addressed." Dean met his eyes, calm, unmoving. "I didn't write it to be liked." That answer didn't challenge authority. It removed it. The producer nodded once, more to himself than to Dean. He understood now that his role had shifted. He wasn't deciding whether the material worked. He was deciding whether he was willing to stand in front of it. He folded the page, mirroring Dean's earlier gesture, and held it between his fingers. "Let me think," he said. It wasn't approval. It wasn't rejection. It was uncertainty. And in that quiet doubt, the balance of the room had already changed. The meeting upstairs took place behind a door that rarely closed. That alone told the producer how this would go. 3 men, 1 woman, coffee growing cold, jackets still on, as if no one planned to stay longer than necessary. The paper lay in the center of the table, face down, treated less like a song and more like a document that could complicate lives. They read in silence. No one smiled. No one laughed. There was no argument about quality. That would have been easier. "It's too personal," one of them said at last, not looking up. "There's nowhere for the listener to hide." Another flipped the page as if hoping to find a chorus on the back. "There's no hook, no release. Radio needs a way in." The woman tapped her finger once against the table. This doesn't sound like the Dean Martin people think they know. That, the producer understood, was the real objection. Suggestions followed, practical and reasonable on the surface. Change the last line. Make it less final. Add a familiar refrain, something to anchor it. Soften the implication that the applause ends and nothing replaces it. "We're not killing it," someone said carefully. "We're shaping it." The producer nodded while listening, already aware of the answer forming in his chest. He carried the page back downstairs without committing to anything, his steps measured, as though speed might betray intent. Dean was alone in the smaller studio, lights dimmed low, the room cleared of unnecessary chairs. No entourage, no visitors, just a pianist waiting quietly and a technician behind glass who hadn't asked questions. "They want changes," the producer said. "Not dramatic ones." Dean didn't ask which. "They want safety," the producer added. Dean's response was immediate, but not loud. No. Not refusal as protest. Refusal as fact. The producer studied him. There was no tension in his shoulders, no anger in his voice. That was what made it difficult. This wasn't a negotiation. "If we don't adjust it," the producer said, choosing his words carefully, "they may not approve a session." Dean met his eyes. "Then don't tell them." The risk in that sentence was enormous. The producer felt it land. He understood exactly what was being asked of him. Not loyalty, but alignment. He nodded once. The session was booked late. Too late to draw attention. Minimal staff. No formal slot on the calendar. The kind of recording that could be explained later or erased quietly if necessary. The lights stayed low. The room felt smaller without spectators. Dean stood at the microphone, not rehearsing, not warming up. He adjusted his stance, closed his eyes once, and waited for the cue. The first take wasn't perfect. His voice caught slightly on one line. A breath arrived earlier than planned. The technician glanced through the glass, uncertain. "Keep it," the producer said softly. Dean finished the song without embellishment. No held notes, no flourish at the end. Just silence. No one spoke for a moment. They recorded nothing else. No alternate takes. No experiments. When it was done, Dean stepped away from the microphone and put his jacket back on. Outside, the studio corridor was empty. The producer stayed behind, listening once more through the monitors, aware of what they had just done. The song existed now. Whether anyone else would ever hear it was another question entirely. The first listening wasn't announced as a listening. It happened in a narrow conference room with no windows, the kind designed to prevent distraction. 3 chairs on one side of the table, 2 on the other. The tape machine sat slightly off-center, as if even it wasn't sure it belonged there. No introductions were necessary. Titles mattered more than names. The radio program director leaned back with his arms crossed, face unreadable. The marketing manager sat forward, pen already in hand, prepared to take notes that might never be used. The lawyer didn't touch the table at all. He listened the way people listen when they're trained to hear consequences. The producer pressed play and stepped back. The song filled the room quietly. No one reacted at first. No tapping. No glances exchanged. The voice wasn't performing. It was stating. That alone made everyone uneasy. Halfway through, the marketing manager stopped writing. He stared at the tabletop instead, as if words had suddenly lost their purpose. When the tape ended, the silence felt intentional. "This damages the image," the program director said finally. Not angry, concerned. "People don't want to hear him doubt himself." The lawyer nodded. "It invites interpretation. That's always dangerous." The producer waited. It's honest, the marketing manager said, almost reluctantly. But honesty isn't a selling point. No one disagreed. Then the director added something quieter, almost as a warning. If this goes out, there's no walking it back. You can't make this invisible again. The producer understood what that meant. Control would shift. Once listeners felt addressed instead of entertained, the conversation would no longer belong to the label. The meeting ended without resolution. No rejection. No approval. Just delay. That night, long after the building emptied, the radio director returned to his office. He closed the door, locked it. The city outside had gone soft with distance, traffic reduced to a low hum. He placed the tape on his desk and stared at it longer than he meant to. At 1:12 a.m., he aired it. No announcement, no explanation, just slipped between two songs, as if it had wandered there on its own. By morning, the phone lines lit up, not with volume, but with weight. Listeners didn't ask about charts. They didn't ask for repeats. They asked questions that startled the interns taking calls. Who wrote that? Has he always felt like that? One man said he'd pulled his car over because he couldn't keep driving. A woman said she'd listened from the kitchen floor, afraid to stand up before it ended. The producer heard about the broadcast secondhand, not from the label. He didn't smile when he learned. He closed his eyes for a moment instead. Dean found out even later. Someone mentioned it casually, as if it were weather. They played your new thing last night. Dean didn't respond right away. He sat still, letting the words settle. No relief came, no satisfaction. Just a quiet understanding that something irreversible had begun. The producer called him that afternoon. You said it out loud, he told Dean. The part we've all been avoiding. Dean looked out the window, at nothing in particular. And now? He asked. The producer hesitated. Now they're listening. And that's the part we can't control. The line went quiet. Both men knew this wasn't success. It was exposure. And exposure always demanded a price. The spread wasn't official, and that made it faster. Copies moved hand to hand after midnight shifts. Disc jockeys played it once, then again. Never during peak hours. The song lived in the margins, between last calls and early news, in the quiet pockets where people weren't supposed to be paying attention. Requests began arriving without a pattern. No campaign, no schedule. Just voices asking carefully if that song could be heard again. The label noticed. Not with excitement, but with concern. A meeting was called that didn't feel like a meeting. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just phrases passed across a table, each one designed to soften what followed. It's becoming something, someone said. And that's exactly the issue, another replied. We didn't authorize this momentum. They were afraid of precedent. If this worked, other artists would ask for the same freedom. Control would loosen, quietly but permanently. The proposal they drafted sounded reasonable, strategic, protective. The song would be released, carefully, limited, framed as an experiment. Dean Martin's name would appear, but not prominently. Smaller type, less emphasis. Enough to avoid confrontation, not enough to define him. It keeps him safe, the marketing manager said. And us. The producer delivered the offer himself. He didn't dress it up. He laid it out cleanly, one sentence at a time. Dean listened without interruption. No visible reaction. When the explanation ended, he waited a few seconds before speaking. No, he said. The producer exhaled slowly. If you don't take this, he said, they may stop calling. Studio dates, support, all of it. Dean nodded. He had already reached that conclusion on his own. I know, he replied. There was no bravado in his voice, no romanticism, just acceptance. A pause settled between them, heavier than any argument. "They're asking you to disappear a little," the producer said quietly. "Just enough." Dean shook his head once. "I've done enough of that." What surprised the producer wasn't the refusal. It was the calm certainty behind it. Dean wasn't protecting an image. He was protecting authorship. Later that week, a small venue confirmed an open night. No press, no broadcast. A room that held people, not expectations. Dean agreed to sing once, not to promote, not to persuade, for himself. When the label heard, they didn't object. They didn't approve either. Silence, again, as policy. Before the show, the producer found Dean backstage. He adjusted his cuffs slowly, methodically. "They'll blame this if things cool off," the producer said. Dean smiled faintly. "They'll blame it anyway." He stepped toward the stage without waiting for introduction. No explanation, no framing, just a man walking into his own words. Back in the office, someone remarked, almost casually, "If this keeps going, it could stall him here." No one answered. They all understood the same thing. Some costs aren't negotiated. They're paid. The room held fewer people than most rehearsals. No cameras, no stage manager counting seconds. Just a low ceiling, a handful of chairs, and light that didn't flatter anyone. The kind of place where sound reached the walls before it reached the audience. Dean stepped out without announcement. No greeting, no context. He waited until the small movements stopped, until coats settled, until breathing found a rhythm. Only then did he speak. He didn't name the song. He didn't need to. The first notes came slower than the recording. Not dragged, considered. He left space between phrases, not as effect, but because the words required room. He let silence finish thoughts he chose not to complete. His voice wasn't fighting age. It wasn't reaching. It stayed where it was, grounded, carrying weight without effort. Each pause landed heavier than the line before it. In the back, the producer sat still. He didn't cross his arms, didn't nod. He watched the way people watch something they don't intend to interfere with. When Dean reached the final line, he didn't resolve it. He let it remain open, unfinished, as it had always been. The last note faded into the room and stayed there. No one clapped. Not immediately. For several seconds, the quiet held. Not out of confusion, out of recognition. People remained seated, hands resting where they were, as if movement might cheapen what had just happened. Dean didn't bow. He didn't look for approval. He stepped back once, then turned and walked off the stage. Behind him, someone finally exhaled. Then another. Applause followed, restrained, almost reluctant, like an afterthought. Backstage, no one rushed him. No congratulations, no analysis. Just the sound of a door closing gently. Later, the producer found him near the exit. "That did it," he said. Dean looked at him. "Did what?" "They won't touch the recording," the producer replied. "They heard it, the way it's supposed to be heard." Dean nodded, but there was no relief in the gesture, only acceptance. As he reached for his coat, one of the musicians spoke from the corner of the room. "You know this is going to change things," he said. Dean paused, not for effect, for honesty. "I don't," he answered quietly, "but I know it was true." Outside, the night was calm. No crowd, no waiting cars, just a streetlight and the sound of distant traffic. He walked away without looking back. And only then did it become clear. Those 60 seconds had never been about saving a career. They had been about saying one thing once without hiding, and letting the silence answer.